Today on Steady Habits, we bring you the story of Mad Dog and Meatball. Joseph Mad Dog Taborsky was the first person sentenced to death twice in Connecticut. Spoiler alert, he was only executed once. Arthur Culombe took his case to the United States Supreme Court. Welcome to Steady Habits, Connecticut's true crime podcast. I'm Chris De Musique.
And I'm Krystle, Chris's better half.
And we're your hosts. We're a husband and wife podcast team. We're both lawyers, although we're not a husband and wife legal team. I'm a trial attorney with my own practice based in West Haven, Connecticut. I focus on criminal defense and juvenile law.
Okay, and I do contracts and work in-house in New York City. We both grew up in Connecticut, and we're still here today.
We're fans of the law and true crime, and we decided to start this podcast. One of Connecticut's nicknames is the land of steady habits. We're a small state, but we have a lot of legal history, from murders, the mob, celebrities, and Supreme Court cases. And for our first episode, we're covering the Mad Dog killings, the story of Joseph Taborsky and Arthur Culombe, who committed several murders in the 1950s.
Okay, so let's talk about Joseph Taborsky's early life. So he was born in 1925 and grew up in the north end of Hartford. Hartford is Connecticut's capital city. It's nicknamed the Insurance City, and it's still home to a number of insurance companies today. It was also home to the Hartford Whalers at one point. UConn plays a lot of basketball games there. If you watch, big fans of college basketball out there. And at one point, the Patriots considered moving here in the 90s, but sadly, they did not.
Now, according to Gerald De Musique, who covered the story for the Hartford Courant, was a leading crime reporter back in that time. He also became close to Taborsky. Taborsky's childhood bedroom overlooked the Hartford County Jail's prison yard, and that's a pretty bad place. It was on Syme Street. It was referred to as the Syme Street Jail. It's since been replaced by Hartford Correctional Center on Weston Street, but by all accounts, this jail was just a hellhole. From when it opened in the 1870s to when it closed in the 1970s. For years, it didn't have sewer lines. It also had cells that were above the boiler room, and the floors literally burned inmates. It's not a good place to be, but Joe must have seen something that he liked there because he eventually wound up there himself.
So Joseph's first crime was stealing a tricycle when he was 7. Then when he turned 14, he went to reform school. He really liked to steal things, I guess, throughout this time period. Then he grew up. He grew into a really big guy. He grew up to be about 6'4", and he continued committing those larcenies and burglaries. But then in 1950, he graduated to violent crime. So let's talk about the first case. So on the night of March 23rd, 1950, Joseph was turning 25, and he and his brother Albert went to one of their friends to have some cake for his birthday. Then they decided, you know what, let's drive around and find a place to rob, because that's a good way to celebrate your birthday, I guess. I don't know. So they decided to go to rob Cooper's Package Store on New Park Ave in West Hartford.
So for any listeners who aren't from New England, you might be wondering what the package store is. It's actually not a FedEx or UPS store, a place where you buy boxes or packages. It's actually a liquor store. It's a regional term that you only hear really in this part of the country. You might hear packy if someone's really trying a bad Boston accent. That term goes back to the old days when blue laws and the temperance movement, and then just prim and proper New Englanders didn't want to talk about booze and sots and undesirable things. So they referred to liquor stores as package stores, in that the drinks were in packaged containers as opposed to bars. So anyway, back to Cooper's Package Store.
Okay. So this recounting of what happened is all going to come from Albert's testimony, which is going to come in handy later on when we talk about this case. So when they decided to take this drive, they took Albert's car, which was a 1936 Ford. So Albert stayed in the car while Joseph took his .22 caliber revolver he also had on him and a trench coat and went into the store. Minutes later, he comes running out, jumps in the car, and tells Albert to take off. Joseph then tells Albert that the owner of the store, a man named Louis Wolfson, jumped him and that the gun went off accidentally and shot him.
That always happens.
Yep. Louis had been shot in the face but didn't die right away. He was taken to the hospital and unfortunately later died a few days later, but he was able to recount what had happened. So a year later, January 1951, so remember this incident took place in March 1950, the police arrested Albert and Joseph. They actually were questioning Albert about an unrelated case. I think these guys are really criminals here. And he admitted that he and Joseph were responsible for the robbery and the murder at the package store. He therefore signed a confession, and that was actually read to Joseph.
So Joseph was charged with murder. Actually, they were both charged with murder. Joseph took his case to trial later on in 1951, and Albert pled to second-degree murder in exchange for a life sentence to testify against Joseph. Joseph was charged with capital murder, so he faced the death penalty. Albert was the only witness who actually directly implicated Joe. There was a bystander who saw the two of them from across the street, but it was dark, couldn't give a clear identification. And also, Lewis Wolfson, the victim, died, so he couldn't testify at trial. But his statements to the police were admitted into evidence. Those didn't come in the dying declarations, which is an exception to the hearsay rule. So just a quick legal lesson. Ordinarily, an out-of-court statement can't be admitted for the truth of the matter asserted in that statement. That would be hearsay. One exception is the dying declaration, which is a statement made by a deceased person on his or her deathbed. But that would actually pose a confrontation clause problem in a criminal case because under the Sixth Amendment, you have a right to face your accuser. In this case, though, both Joe's attorney and also the state's attorney stipulated to its admission, and you'll see why.
So for the defense, this was actually a good thing because Wolfson said the shooter was about 5'8" and having light hair. Now remember we mentioned that Taborsky grew up to be tall and 6'4", and he had dark hair and a large chin.
His chin actually comes up a lot in these cases. He's described as lantern jaw. His nickname was actually the Chin. See some pictures, and we'll post some online. He had a very big chin. So it's a pretty distinctive feature. One of the reasons why it suggested he wore the coat and put a coat over his face. So at trial, Joe's defense attorney, Nathaniel Bergman, grilled Albert on cross. He was the chief witness. He attacked his credibility. They also called other family members to attack Albert's credibility. They said that he was crazy. Joe took the stand and denied committing the crimes, but he was convicted and he was sentenced to death. He took a direct appeal, went to the Connecticut Supreme Court of Errors. That's what our highest court was called back then. Now it's just the Supreme Court, but then it was Supreme Court of Errors. As my father's former law school professor said, the Supreme Court of many errors. There also was an intermediate appeal court back then as there is now. The court upheld the conviction and sentence. One of the contentions on appeal was the two-witness rule. Connecticut had a law that for death penalty crimes, a person had to be convicted by the testimony of two witnesses. Joe's attorneys argued that although there were multiple witnesses, only one, Albert, implicated Joe directly. Supreme Court of Errors said that's not how that statute works. As long as the totality of the evidence comes from more than two witnesses, that's enough to prove the case. It doesn't need to be two eyewitnesses. But that wasn't the end of Joe Taborsky.
This is one of my favorite parts of this case. So this is really convenient. So after the trial, it was found out that Albert had been transferred from prison to a state mental hospital in Norwich. He had been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, which, again, this is very convenient all of a sudden. Joseph found out about this, and his attorney filed a petition for a new trial.
So you can move for a new trial shortly after a conviction. After a trial, there are various post-trial motions you could file: motion for a new trial, motion to set aside, motion for a judgment of acquittal. So they did file that motion, but then the case went up on direct appeal. It was affirmed. But you could petition for a new trial on newly discovered evidence. And in this case, the new evidence was Albert being nutso. That wasn't completely known to the defense. And they knew he was crazy, and they certainly argued it. But at the time, they didn't actually have psychiatrist testimony, and he also hadn't been committed to a state mental hospital. So they had a hearing in the trial court where witnesses from the jail, the mental hospital, and psychiatrists testified about Albert's bizarre behavior, which includes hearing voices, having delusions, and also masturbating out in the open. They concluded that he was insane, and at the time he testified, he was insane, and also not likely restorable. So the trial court denied the petition, but it was then appealed again to the Supreme Court of Errors, who this time did find error, and they reversed the conviction. Now, the state had a problem at this time. The only direct witness was institutionalized, and his credibility was just destroyed. The state just decided not to retry him, so he was released. He went from being on death row to being a free man.
I just find this to be so bizarre how, the first time, if he really was crazy, why they couldn't put on evidence. But, I mean, Joseph got lucky. So anyway, moving on. Joseph spent about 4 years on death row at the state prison in Wethersfield. During that time, he had a really important job. He actually cleaned out the execution chamber after electrocutions were carried out. Quite an important job, I guess. When he left prison, he said that he was a new man and that he'd never be going back, and he would be a saint. He wouldn't even get a parking ticket. He decided to move to Brooklyn, but he would occasionally be that very good son and come home to see his mother Mabel here in Hartford.
So you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You also can't teach a mad dog new tricks. Joseph's straight and narrow life didn't last long. He came back to Connecticut and reunited with an old friend, Arthur Culombe, who just had the nickname Meatball. They met back in 1948. They worked together at a company in East Hartford called Hartford Dispatch. They were the same age. The U.S. Supreme Court referred to Arthur as a mental defective of the moron class with an IQ of 64. Not a great endorsement by the highest court of the land. He was, however, married, had children, and liked to collect guns. They soon started committing larcenies and burglaries together, and then upped it to robberies. So you see a progression of property crime. Larceny is when the person takes something that doesn't belong to him or her with the intent to deprive the owner of ownership. Burglary is when a person enters or remains in a dwelling with the intent to commit a felony therein. It used to have to be at night, not so much anymore. Also doesn't have to be a felony anymore. So usually the felony that's attempted to be committed is a larceny, some sort of theft, but it actually doesn't have to be. Just common parlance, people say their house got robbed. No, your house got broken into or burgled, but that's the difference between larceny, robbery, and, well, robbery is when you use force to create a larceny. So they moved on to robbery. The first robbery was in 1956. They robbed the Hartford Hotel, but didn't kill anybody. They shortly after robbed Rosen's package store and pistol whipped the owner, Jack Rosen. They then robbed the package store in Rocky Hill. Then December 15th, 1956, they robbed the tailor, Nicola Leone, in Hartford. They shot him, but he survived. And later that night,
I guess you can say they really escalated to murder. So anyway, this brings us to Kirk's gas station. So that same night, December 15th, they went to the gas station on Stanley Street in New Britain. There was a big ice storm that night. So
New Britain's a smaller city in Hartford County, has about 75,000 people. It was the home to Stanley Tool's, the Central Connecticut State University, and just happened to have a large Polish American population as you can tell by the names of our two unfortunate victims in this case.
Right. So Joseph went to use the men's room while the owner, Edward Taborsky, serviced the car. So back then you got full service, and I don't really know anyone who really does that anymore except maybe stay in New Jersey.
We actually have a friend who doesn't pump her own gas, so she probably would have gone to a gas station like this.
Yeah, shout out Stacy if you're listening. Okay, so Culombe then pulled out his gun and forced Taborsky into the boiler room, where he then shot him and took his wallet. Taborsky went through the office and cash register taking more money. Then a little while later, another person, Daniel Janowski, look at all these Polish names, drove up to the gas station, and he had his 18-month-old daughter in the car. He stopped and waited at the pump. Taborsky and Culombe waited for him to leave, but when Daniel wouldn't leave, they went outside. Culombe pretended to service the car, while Taborsky then ordered Janowski to the bathroom, where he shot him and took his wallet. They left the daughter in the car. And then they went back to Culombe's house and split the money, and then Taborsky drove the long drive back to Brooklyn. Less than a week later, they then robbed a grocery store in Coventry, which was owned by a gentleman named Arthur Vinton and his wife. Those individuals were not shot, but they were knocked out by the two men. Taborsky told Culombe to shoot their granddaughter. Taborsky, obviously was a little more aggressive. Culombe seems to have some sort of moral compass in him. He did take the child back into the back room and fired a shot into the floor, did not actually shoot the child. Then later, about 10 days later on December 26th, they robbed, shot, and killed Sam Cohn at his package store in East Hartford. Then we're going to continue the violence here. January 5th, 1957, they robbed Casco's Drive-In shoe outlet in North Haven.
Yeah, this is actually a geographic outlier. For anyone unfamiliar with Connecticut geography, all the previous robberies and murders were committed in the Hartford area. Rocky Hill is south of Hartford. New Britain is southwest of Hartford. Coventry is actually a bit farther out, going toward Yukon, but still not that far from Hartford. Coventry is also the home of Connecticut state hero Nathan Hale, if you want to know that. But North Haven is right above New Haven, southern part of the state, not far from where I grew up. So they shot and killed an older couple, Bernard and Ruth Spire. Frank Adinolfi worked at the store, but he survived. And the police had their first real lead after this robbery. And at the time, this was a crime spree. People in the state were terrified that there were robbers and murderers, because it's pretty obvious, or at least not obvious, but it's pretty well thought that the same people were behind this. They're robbing stores late at night, liquor stores, and now a shoe store. So before robbing the shoe store, Taborsky asked Adinolfi for a size 12 shoe to try on. Now, this case is being investigated by Sam Rome, who's lieutenant for the state police. And this is, again, a high-profile crime. People were terrified. Detectives and police were looking for anybody. And they decided to look at prison records and find out what recently released prisoner wore a size 12 shoe. Joe Taborsky came up. So Rome showed Adinolfi a picture of him, and he positively identified him. But that wasn't before they robbed their last store. On January 26, 1957, the two robbed Rosenthal's drugstore in Maple Avenue in Hartford. They robbed and shot the owner, John Rosenthal, in the chest, and he died. They were arrested on February 23rd of 1957. So acting on their shoe lead, the state police went to Taborsky's mother's house in Hartford and found him and Culombe there, asked them to come and talk to them, said they weren't under arrest. Taborsky and Culombe said, "Oh, yeah, sure." And they went to state police headquarters. And then they were never out of police custody after that. So they actually...
What does it mean to be in custody?
Well, being in custody means you can't leave. So if you're being actually legally detained by the police. Now, police do this a lot. Rather than get a warrant or make an arrest, they'll ask people to come speak to them voluntarily. Hey, come down. We're going to ask you some questions. Let's talk about this. A lot of people actually do it.
Don't do it.
Yeah, talk to your attorney first. And someone like me would probably give you the advice of don't do it. And then after you've done it before and then hire us, we'll say you really shouldn't have done that. But that's what they did. So for the next few days, these two guys were in custody. The state police drove them around to different scenes. To Coventry, to Rocky Hill. They took them out to dinner. They went to diners. They held them overnight. They're interrogating them for hours.
I just enjoy how they went to diners. I just want to really know what they talked about during this time.
I was wondering the same thing. While they were at the diner, were they just making small talk, or were they actually talking about the crime? And what were they buying? They arguing over the tip. I just don't know. But either way, when they're going back to the state police headquarters, they're interrogating them for hours at a time. So Culombe actually asked for a lawyer, and Rome said, you can call any lawyer you want, and give him a phone book. But he also knew that Culombe was illiterate and couldn't read or use a phone book. So later that night, the police charged them with breach of peace. Not yet murder, but there was a statute that allowed them to charge without a warrant if they suspect them of committing a felony. So that's why they were held. And they charged them with breach of peace, which is a misdemeanor. Now, not usually, when you're arrested and held in custody, meaning you don't bond out, you have to be presented before a court on the next court day. Now here, the police should have taken them to court on Monday because it's occurred over a weekend. They actually waited until Tuesday so they could keep questioning them. And they questioned them and they gave statements. So on February 26th, the police took them to New Britain Police Court. Police court we have a different court system now. Connecticut has a two-tiered criminal system for courts. Police court was a more local type court where a judge, actually a justice of the peace, could address your bond, arraign you. You actually could have trials there, but if you lost, you could appeal to Superior Court. This police court is described as a room that had a cage in the middle of it while the two of them were locked up. And photographed by reporters. No bond was set, so on this misdemeanor, there's no bond. They were not advised of their right to counsel. They were then released back into state police custody, and the state police continued to interrogate them. They were eventually indicted on murder a few weeks later on March 14th.
Yeah, so they were in custody for 3 weeks.
Yeah, and they couldn't bond out, or they didn't want to get out. So they're charged with murder. They went to trial. The first and only trial was on the Kirk's gas station murders. The defense attempted to suppress the confessions, which seemed pretty bad. They were definitely held without having a right to counsel. Just the fact that they were being driven around and questioned continuously. But those motions were denied and the confessions were admitted. They were both convicted on June 27, 1957. They took a direct appeal to the Connecticut Supreme Court of Errors. That was affirmed February 16th of 1960. And this is where the two paths of Taborsky and Culombe diverge. So Taborsky didn't pursue any appeals after his direct appeal, and he could have. He could have taken it to the U.S. Supreme Court. He could have attempted collateral matters, ineffective assistance, stays of execution, but he decided he didn't want to do that. So he was executed in the electric chair on May 17th of 1960. But before that, he had something to eat.
Yes, so the last meal, I guess that's an important thing. He had a cherry soda and a banana split.
Yeah, sounds pretty good to me. And what would you have for your last meal?
That's a really hard decision because you know how much difficulty I have trying to figure out what I'm going to have to eat for dinner on a daily basis.
Right, I mean...
I'd have like a never-ending meal.
Could you get a buffet for your last meal?
I probably would.
You'd probably be the first person to have to ask a court for a stay of execution just so you could decide your last meal.
Probably.
So Gerald De Musique witnessed the execution, the reporter for the Current, and Taborsky waved goodbye to him. He was shocked with 2,000 volts 3 times. He died. He gave his body to the Yale School of Medicine, and before he died, he confessed to the murder of Louis Wolfson. Mad Dog, as he was nicknamed, became the last person executed in the electric chair. Also, the second to last person executed in Connecticut, Michael Ross, was executed in, I think, 2005 or 2006. We'll probably do an episode on him. And that's it. Connecticut no longer has the death penalty. Gerald De Musique, and the Current writer, witnessed it, and he was just a throwback crime reporter who was known to befriend and play cards with death row inmates. He had connections with everybody in town, judges, murderers, gangsters, and he spent 30 years covering crime. And maybe today he'd have a podcast, but back then...
He probably would. He'd have a really interesting podcast.
Yeah. But again, a lot of the articles we read were written by Gerald De Musique. He also wrote the book on this case, 10 Weeks of Terror, which I'd like to get a copy of.
If someone has one, please send it to Chris. He would love to have one.
So Mad Dog was no more. But Arthur Culombe kept going. He did appeal his case to the United States Supreme Court, and it was reversed because the confession was considered involuntary. So this was in the early 60s. It was still a few years before the Miranda case, which required the Miranda warnings to be read to people who were arrested. But even before that, confessions still had to be voluntary. They couldn't be beaten out of you. They couldn't have been too deceptively obtained. And just based on everything that we had said, where they were held for a long time without attorneys, how they were taken all over the place, the Supreme Court, in a decision, said that their wills were broken. The confession wasn't voluntary. This person was illiterate, he was a simpleton, and he was just ruthlessly questioned. That also wasn't the last time Lieutenant Sam Rome had a conviction tossed by the United States Supreme Court. It happened again a few years later. But even though his conviction was reversed, Culombe decided not to go to trial because there were other murders the state could have tried him on, and he didn't want to risk being convicted and executed. So he pled out to a life in prison term. And he spent the rest of his life in prison, not a whole lot longer, really. He died on December 21st, which was the same day they committed one of their murders. December 21st of 1970 at the age of 46 in Summers, which was the Connecticut maximum security prison at the time. That was Osborne CI. That was the end of the Meatball. But Culombe versus Connecticut is still good law. It eventually did lead to criminal justice reform and interrogation law. In addition to that legacy, a couple other things. Connecticut liquor store laws changed as a result of the Mad Dog killings. Back in the 50s, liquor stores or package stores were open late at night. They're open until 10, 11 o'clock. After this wave of shootings and crime, stores asked to be able to close earlier. Their hours were rolled back to 8 o'clock. It's been just recently that they've been open later. Went to 9 o'clock. I think now they're open until 10 o'clock. But that's a big deal for a lot of people growing up in the 80s and 90s, that you had to plan when you wanted to get some beer. The other thing was, back in the 50s, there were calls for Connecticut to abolish its death penalty. Governor Ribicoff even wanted to do it. And the Current had editorials that wanted it to be abolished. And then came this wave of crime. And that was put on hold for about another 65 years. It was finally repealed in 2012. After Taborsky died, the Current had an editorial that said a mad dog was put down. So set back justice as well. But that is the end of Mad Dog Joseph Taborsky and Arthur Meatball Culombe. Plan to do some additional episodes on Connecticut true crime. At some point, we might do the Michael Skakel case, Jim Morrison's arrest in New Haven, and many others. This is our first episode. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope to bring you more. From Chris and Krystle, this is Steady Habits. Before we go, we'd like to give a shout out to those who came before us and wrote articles that we used. So Brian W. Weiss wrote The Mad Dog Killers, Culombe versus Connecticut, 25 years later, the June 1986 issue of Voices of Defense, the Journal of the Texas Criminal Defense Lawyers Association. We also read The Obituary of Gerald De Musique by Colin Poitras, which ran in the Current in April of 2007. One Law and the Violent History Behind It by Dick Ailes, which ran in the New York Times, August 6, 2003. And When Mad Dog Was Put to Death, written by Lynn Toohey for the Hartford Current, January 2nd, 2005. Additionally, we relied on the facts of State versus Taborsky, Taborsky versus State, and Culombe versus Connecticut, which are all available wherever you read and download legal cases. For those of you who are listening to us on the Anchor platform, you can ride out with some lightning with Metallica. For those of you who are not, see you next time.